So, good morning, everyone. My name is Arafat. I teach history on the textbook platform. So, in this session, let us discuss a very important topic of modern Indian history, that is the British economic policies. British economic policies. So, this topic is very important from both the prelims as well as the mains examination point of view. Fact, many times questions were asked by UPSC in both the prelims and mains from this particular topic. And once again, questions could be asked even in the future examinations as well. So this topic is very important. Pay attention to this topic. So the point is the uh, British economic policies uh, were never stable. The economic policies followed by Britain in India were never stable. They kept changing with time. So the point is, the British economic policies kept changing with time, and these British economic policies can be discussed in four distinct phases. At the point. The point is, what was common in all the four phases of British economic policies was the exploitation of India. So the point is, the British kept changing its policies with time, but what remained common across its policies, economic policies, was the British exploitation of India. At a point, what remained common was the exploitation of the Indian economy. At a point. So the point is, let us spend some time discussing about the various phases of the British economic policy. Also understand how each of these policies followed by the British affected negatively or positively Indians. At a point. So let us spend time discussing about these different British economic policies. So the point is, the British the British landed India in 1608. The British came to India in 1608 AD. They came to India to undertake trade. So they came to India for trade. So therefore, from 16, and it was only in 1757 AD that the British company, that is the English East India Company, which came to India for trade, got transformed into a territorial power. So, in other words, between 1608 to 1757, the East India Company was merely a trading entity. It was just a commercial establishment. It was involved in India in trade, and this trade, in fact, benefited Indians to a very great extent. Let me repeat this point once again. I told you the British economic policies can be discussed in about four phases. Now let us spend some time discussing about the first phase. The first phase lasted between 1600 AD to 1750 AD, approximately, not the exact date, but approximate time period, 1600 to 1750 AD. So why is this 1600 AD? Because it was in 1608 the British company, that is the English East India Company, landed in India, came to India for trade, and it remained involved in trade until 1757 AD. So between 1608 to 1757, the English East India Company was merely just a trading entity. At a point, and during this period, that is between 1600 to 1750, it was to a very great extent beneficial to the Indians. In fact, this phase was beneficial to everyone. It was a win-win situation for everyone. Who are these individuals? Say, for example, the British company benefited during this phase. The English East India Company benefited because it was greatly involved in trade. So it was making handsome profits. So therefore, this stage was beneficial to English East India Company. Second, the Indian artisans also benefited because the English East India Company was purchasing goods from the Indian artisans. So therefore, their business was flourishing. They also made a lot of profits. So this phase, in fact, also benefited the Indian artisans. As so, for example, East India Company was purchasing textiles. East India Company was also purchasing spices and other commodities from the Indians. So therefore, the Indian businessmen also benefited as a result of uh, uh, trade that was being carried out uh, by various European companies, including English East India Company. Third, Indian rulers also benefited in this phase because the European trading companies were required to pay import and export taxes. We call as import duty, and export duty. Export duty. These are nothing but the taxes which the European trading companies paid to the Indian rulers uh, whenever they imported goods from Europe or whenever they exported goods from India to Europe. So, therefore, the point which I'm trying to convey is the first phase that was between 1600 to 1750 AD was beneficial to everyone. It was beneficial to the European trading companies, including the English East India Company. Let me clarify this point here itself. I use the term European companies because um, the East India Company or the English East India Company was not the only European company to operate in India. Besides the English East India Company, the other European companies also had their settlements, their trading activities in India. So, for example, the Portuguese, the Portuguese also had their trade settlements in India. Second, the Dutch, that is the nationals of Netherlands, also had their settlements in India. Third, the British also had their settlements in India. Fourth, Danes, that is the people of Denmark, also had their settlements in India. Fifth, the French also had their settlements in India. So the point is, English East India Company, that is the British company, was one of the five European trading companies which was actively involved in carrying out trade between India and Europe at a point. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is during phase one, it was beneficial to everyone who were involved in trade. This phase was beneficial to the European companies, including the English East India Company, which is basically the British company. The point. So because it was carrying out a trade, it was making money, it was profitable company. Similarly, the Indian artisans, the Indian merchants, the Indian farmers, is the peasants also benefited because these European companies purchased goods from the Indian artisans, traders, and farmers and sold the same in the European market. So, therefore, there was a great demand for the Indian goods as a result of the coming to India of all of these European companies. Third, these European companies were also paying import duties and export duties on the trade which they carried in India. So, whenever they exported goods to Europe from India, these European companies paid taxes to the Indian rulers. So, therefore, it was an additional source of revenue income to the Indian rulers. That is, the rulers also benefited during this particular phase. So, this phase, in fact, benefited everyone. So therefore, scholars refer to the first phase of British rule in India as the last spark of the dying lamp. Scholars very famously refer to the first phase of the British economic policies as the last spark of the dying lamp. This was because this was basically the phase one was a period of calm KLM before the storm of British economic exploitation began. So basically, phase one was a period of calm, period of peace before the storm of British economic exploitation of India began or started. That's the point. So that's about phase one. So nothing much happened. It was beneficial to everyone. Take a look at phase two. Phase two. So phase two is often referred to as a phase of mercantile capitalism. Phase two, it is also called as a monopoly stage. Let me repeat. Phase two of British economic policies is referred to as a mercantile capitalism phase, or it is also called as a monopoly stage. That's the point. And this phase began in 1757. It continued up till 1813, roughly for about 50 years. 1757 to about 1813. That's the point. So let us understand the changes or the new developments that happened in India during this. That's the point. So let us understand important developments that happened in India or uh, that came into existence in India during this. Important development number one is that it was during this phase that the English East India Company finally got transformed from merely a trading entity to a territorial power. So the point is, East India Company came to India in 1608. Till 1757, it was merely involved in trade. But in 1657, East India Company fought a war in Bengal called the Battle of Plassey. So the East India Company finally in 1757 fought a war in Bengal called the Battle of Plassey. In this war, the East India Company, the English East India Company, emerged victorious. So it was after this battle the foundations of the British rule in India began to be laid. Following this battle, the foundations of the British rule in India came to be laid. At the point. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is some very important developments happened, or uh, uh, some very important developments took place during this phase. Development number one is that it was during this phase that English East India Company finally got transformed from merely a trading entity to a territorial power. How? Because in 1757, East India Company fought a war in Bengal called the Battle of Plassey. This war, the East India Company emerged victorious, resulting in it emerging as a political entity, a territorial entity in Bengal. This was the first major development. Second, and perhaps this is also a very important development, it was during this period, that is between 1757 to 1813, that English East India Company emerged as a monopoly trading power in India. A monopoly trading power in India. So what do we mean by monopoly trading? So I just explained a short while ago that besides the East India Company, besides the English East India Company, there were also other European companies operating in India. So for example, I just discussed about the Portuguese company. I discussed about the Portuguese company, the Dutch company. So I discussed about the Danish company, is the company belonging to Denmark. And fifth is the French company. So besides the British, there were also other European trading companies operating in India. During this phase, that is between 1757 to 1813, the English East India Company fought wars with most of the other European trading companies. In these wars, the other European trading companies were defeated, as a result of which the English East India Company emerged as a monopoly trading power in India. This point is very, very important to understand. So what happened during this stage? During the second stage, English East India Company fought wars with its European competitors. So, for example, the British fought wars with France or the French East India Company. The British also fought wars with the, the Portuguese company. At two points. The British also fought wars with the Dutch company. So, in all of these wars, the British company, that is English East India Company, emerged victorious. So, as a result of its victory, as a result, uh, the English East India Company, after all of these victories, managed to get rid of their European competitors. It managed to emerge as a monopoly trading company in India. You must understand this point. The point is, if there are too many competitors in India for the British, obviously the greater the competition, lesser will be the profit margin. So if there is too much competition for any trader, obviously the trader would sell his goods cheap because of the competition from the other traders. But if there are no other traders, then British, because there were no other European traders in India, so naturally the English East India Company emerged as a monopoly trading power and used its monopoly power to make profits. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is two major developments took place in India during the phase two. That is, in first development is East India Company emerged as a territorial power, and second, East India Company got rid of their European competitors and managed to emerge as a monopoly trading power in India. This is the important development. These two were the important developments. Then what was the impact of these developments on the people of India? Let us understand. What was the impact of these developments on people of India? Let us understand. So let us not understand the impact on the people or outcome of this stage on the people of India. One, exploitation of Indian resources began from this stage. Okay, point. So basically, it was from this stage. I told you between 1600 to 1750. This stage of During this stage, Indians benefited as a result of trade between India and Europe. But from 1750s onwards, all of this changed. Economic exploitation of India's resources began from 1750 onward. How did this exploitation begin? Let us understand. So, one, gifts and bribes. So, basically, I told you it was in 1757 that the East India Company, uh, uh, after fighting the Battle of Plassey, emerged as a territorial power in Bengal. So basically, in 1757, East India Company fought a battle in Bengal called Battle of Plassey. In that battle, the East India Company emerged victorious. But the point is, though it emerged victorious, East India Company did not occupy Bengal till 1772 AD. So the Battle of Plassey happened in 1757. The ruler of Bengal, by name Sirajuddaulah, was defeated, but East India Company did not uh, occupy Bengal. It it occupied Bengal only in the year 1772 AD. It means that for 15 years between 1757 to 1772, East India Company ruled Bengal indirectly. So in 1757, the Battle of Plassey was won by British, but British did not occupy Bengal. They occupied Bengal only in the year 1772. It means that for 15 years, the British did not occupy Bengal. They did not rule Bengal directly. Instead, they ruled Bengal through their puppet rulers between 1757 to 1772. So between 1757 to 1772, the British ruled Bengal through their puppet rulers, uh, and these puppet rulers of Bengal began showering gifts on the East India Company. Basically, the puppet rulers of Bengal started giving too many bribes to the English East India Company because uh, they became the rulers after all with the support of the English East India Company. Hence, they started bribing the East India Company. And that's how India's wealth began to be exploited. That's how Indian resources, India's wealth began to be exploited from 1757 onwards. So I'm trying to explain what I'm trying to explain is it was during second phase that the economic exploitation of India's resources began. But I'm trying to explain to you in what ways the economic exploitation began. At a point. One way is through gifts and bribes. So what are gifts and bribes? Gifts, these are nothing but the money that the Indian rulers gave to the English East India Company. Gifts are nothing but the money which the rulers of Bengal gave to the English East India Company between 1757 to 1772. I hope I am clear. I already explained you the reasons. This is because the Battle of Plassey was fought in 1757. British emerged victorious, yet British did not occupy Bengal. Instead, they started ruling Bengal through their puppet rulers, to their puppets at a point. So these puppets of the English East India Company uh, started showering favors on the English East India Company in the form of gifts and bribes. And that's how the exploitation of India began. Second, the English East India Company earned a lot of money through duty free trade. So I told you that in the first phase, that is between 1600 to 1750, the English East India Company, or for that matter, other European companies, were required to pay import duties and export duties whenever they either imported goods or exported goods out of India. They paid these duties to the Indian rulers. But from 1757 onwards, East India Company began carrying out a duty-free trade. Duty-free means it neither pays import tax nor it pays export tax or export duty. This was because East India Company itself emerged as a political master because it won the war, it won the Battle of Plassey in 1757. So it had political power and used its political power to uh, since it itself was since East India Company itself was enjoying political power, it stopped paying import and export taxes to the Indian rulers, particularly to the rulers of Bengal. This is what happened. Let me repeat this point once again. From 1757 onwards, East India Company stopped paying import taxes and export taxes to the rulers of Bengal because they themselves became the rulers of Bengal. They themselves had the political power, and therefore East India Company stopped paying taxes to the rulers of Bengal. So this was another way in which the wealth of India began to be exploited. Then third, Diwani rights. Diwani in simple terms means revenue rights. So in 1765, the East India Company took over the Diwani, the revenue collection rights in Bengal. I told you in 1757, East India Company won the Battle of Plassey. It took over complete control of Bengal only in 1772. But in between this time period, in 1765, East India Company took over the Diwani of Bengal. Diwani is revenue collection rights of Bengal. Diwani means revenue administration. So in 1765, the East India Company took over the Diwani, that is the, the revenue uh, department of Bengal was taken over by the British in 1765 AD. At the point. So the law and order administration and judicial administration was still kept in the hands of the Nawab of Bengal. The, the judicial administration and the civil administration were still left, they were still kept under the control of the Nawab of Bengal. But from 1765 AD onwards, the British took over the land revenue administration. That is, the revenue administration was taken over by the British. In other words, from 1765 AD onwards, the British directly took over the responsibility of collecting taxes, particularly land revenue, from the peasants of Bengal. So from 1765 AD onwards, the British took over the responsibility of collecting land revenue from the people of Bengal. This is what happened. At a point. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is till 1765, the East India Company came to India with bullion to purchase goods from the Indian artisans, peasants, etc. Let me repeat. East India Company was established in 1608 until till 1765 AD. East India Company came to India with bullion, that is gold and silver, with which it purchased goods and other commodities from the Indians and sold the same in the European markets, of course, for a profit. But from 1765 AD onwards, East India Company itself took over the responsibility of collecting land revenue from the people of Bengal. And from 1765 AD onwards, the East India Company stopped bringing bullion to India from England. From 1765 AD onwards, East India Company stopped bringing bullion, that is gold and silver, to India from England. Instead, the East India Company started using the money which it collected from the people of Bengal. Instead, from 1765 AD onwards, the East India Company started using the money, the tax collected from the people of Bengal to purchase goods and other commodities from the Indians. So what happened? Till 1765, East India Company brought money from England, used the money to purchase goods from the Indians. But from 1765 AD onwards, East India Company started collecting land revenue from the people of Bengal, used the same money to purchase goods from the Indians and sold them in the European market. In other words, from 1765 AD onwards, East India Company virtually stopped bringing bullion to India. So, in other words, from 1765 AD onwards, East India Company started from 1765 AD onwards, East India Company virtually started getting goods in India free of cost, because it was purchasing, after all, goods with the Indian taxpayers' money. It was collecting taxes from the people of India, people of Bengal, and used the same money to purchase goods from the Indians. So essentially, East India Company began getting goods for free of cost after 1765 AD onwards. This was another way in which East India Company began to exploit the resources of India. The other way is war indemnity. War indemnity. So basically, East India Company fought numerous wars with the Indian rulers, and it began collecting money from the defeated rulers, which we call as war indemnity. Point. So basically, the money that was collected by the East India Company from the defeated Indian rulers is referred to as a war indemnity. So from all the defeated Indian rulers, the East India Company began extracting money. At a point. So war indemnity became another important source of revenue, another source of income to the English East India. So the other way through which the East India Company earned money was through a system called putting out system. Putting out system. So under this system, East India Company gave raw materials to the Indian artisans. It also gave loans to the Indian artisans on the condition that all their output, the final output, shall be sold only to the English East India Company. What is putting out system? It is a system under which the East India Company gave raw material to the Indian artisans. It also gave loans to the Indian artisans on the condition that their entire final output shall be sold only to the English East India Company. This putting out system was also a very exploitative system. How? The point is, the East India Company extended loans to the Indian artisans at high rates of interest. It sold raw material to the Indian artisans at very high prices. Loan it extended at high rates of interest. It extended or it gave raw material to the Indian artisans at very high prices, but purchased the final output from the Indian artisans at the prices dictated by it, at dictated prices. So basically, the Indian artisans were forced to purchase raw material from the East India Company at a very high price, and at the same time they were forced to sell their final output to the English East India Company at the prices fixed by the English East India Company, at prices fixed, at dictated prices of the English East India Company. Then how could East India Company resort to the putting out system? How could it implement putting out system? It implemented putting out system because East India Company had political power after 1756. Basically had political power and used its political power to force the Indian artisans to 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 purchase raw material from the British at high prices and sell their final output to the same English East India Company at the prices fixed by the English East India Company. So both ways the Indian artisans began to be cheated. So take a look at the cheating, the economic exploitation that happened during the second phase. How did this happen? So during the second phase between 1757 to 1813, two major developments happened. One is East India Company got transformed into a territorial power, means that it emerged as a political entity in India from 1757 AD onwards. The second, in the second phase only, the East India Company virtually got rid of their European competitor, and therefore it used its monopoly power to exploit Indians economically in various ways. In which different ways? In what different ways? For example, they exploited Indians in the form of gifts and bribes. They exploited Indians economically by carrying out duty free trade. They exploited by uh, taking over the Diwani rights of Bengal, that is revenue collection of Bengal. Then they exploited Indians um, by imposing and collecting war indemnities from the defeated Indian rulers. Then the fifth is they exploited Indians through a system called putting out system. This was another important method, putting out system. That's about the second phase. Come to phase 3. Phase 3 began in 1813, continued till 1860 AD. 1813 to 1860 AD. So this third phase is called as industrial capitalism phase. This phase is also called as free trade capitalism. Industrial capitalism or free trade capitalism, one and this. So before we discuss this phase, let us understand uh, the great developments that took place in England post 1750s. So some very great developments took place in England in second half of the 18th century AD, that is in post 1750 period, this these developments in England had a direct impact on Indian economy. Let us understand what these changes. So till 1750, so it was in 1750s, in post 1750 time period, industrial revolution occurred in England. Industrial revolution occurred in England. So as a result of so what do you mean by industrial revolution? In simple terms, the factories, the mega factories emerged as the venues of production as a result of industrial revolution. So before the industrial revolution, uh, production was largely carried out in uh, cottage industries. Production was largely confined to the cottage industries before to that of industrial revolution. But after industrial revolution, the factories, the mega factories at a point run by large machines emerged as the venues of production. So in the entire world, England was the first country to experience industrial revolution. And this happened in the second half of the 18th century AD, that is the post 1750s time period. So the point is, England happened to be the first country in the entire world to experience industrial revolution, and you know what we mean by industrial revolution. So till 1750s, uh, England was dependent on India for finished goods. So the point is, before 1750s, India was a economic powerhouse. So England was dependent on India for commodities. Was dependent on India for various goods. Example, textiles. Say for example, Britain imported textiles from India. Britain also imported other manufactured commodities from India. So the uh, before the beginning of industrial revolution, before the start of industrial revolution in England, England was largely dependent on India for various manufactured goods. Example, textiles. But I told you England happened to be the first country in the entire world to experience industrial revolution. So as a result of industrial revolution, England was in a position to manufacture all of its requirements. Point is, as a result of industrial revolution, England was in a position to produce all the goods which it requires. So in fact, it was in a position to produce goods not just to meet the requirements of the people of Britain alone. They began producing goods on a mass scale to meet the demands, meet the needs of the people of other parts of the world as well. Let me repeat this point once again. Industrial revolution happened in England. So England began to produce goods at far cheaper prices. These were the machine made goods, and they were able to produce goods at far cheaper prices. At the point. So after industrial revolution in England, the economic relations between India and Britain changed substantially. How? Because before the industrial revolution, uh, um, England imported its goods from India, but after industrial revolution, there was no requirement for Britain to import goods because Britain itself was in a position to manufacture all the goods which it requires, and more importantly, it also had the capacity to produce goods for other people of the world. And more importantly, the industries of England wanted raw material to carry out their production activities. So the point is, post 1750s, England was in not requirement of any finished goods. Rather, it wanted raw material to carry out production activities. So, for example, uh, textile industry emerged as a very large industry in England post 1750s. So till 1750s, England imported textiles from India, but after 1750s, England itself was producing textiles. But to produce those textiles, England needed cotton, the raw material cotton. So therefore, after 1750s, England did not want India to become an exporter of finished goods. England merely wanted India to become an exporter of raw material to its industries in England. And second, England also wanted India to become the market for its finished. So this is a kind of a role reversal. So before 1750, uh, manufactured goods from exported uh, to England from India, but post 1750s, the opposite began to take place. So the point is, post 1750s, England wanted India to become just a supplier of raw material to its industries. Second, it also wanted, that is, England also wanted India to become a market for its industrial goods, because England was producing goods on a mass scale, was producing goods more than the requirement of its own people. So, therefore, it was looking for markets to sell its surplus production. And this change began to take place in during this phase, that is 1813 to 1860 time period. So, this is the background for the third phase, that is industrial capitalism or free trade capitalism. So, take a look at some important developments during the third phase. One is Charter Act 1813. So this act was passed by the British Parliament, ending the monopoly or the trading monopoly of the East India Company in all the items except in two commodities. Let me repeat. The British Parliament passed an act called Charter Act 1813. So the British Parliament kept, no, it kept passing legislations relating to East India Company for every 20-year period, starting from 1773 AD. So from 1773 AD onwards, East India Company began to be regulated by the British Parliament through various legislations, which we call as the Charter Acts. The first such act was passed in the year 1773. We call it as a Regulating Act. And the British Parliament passed similar such legislations for every 20-year period. And one such legislation was passed in the year 1813. So this 1813 Charter Act uh, abolished the trading monopoly of the East India Company, all the commodities except two, that is tea and opium. In these two commodities, East India Company still enjoyed trading monopoly. Let me repeat. Till I told you East India Company came to India in 1608. So this East India Company came to India with trading monopoly. Means that from 1608 to 1813, other than the English East India Company, no other British company was allowed to trade with India. So between 1608 to 1813, only English East India Company was engaged in trade with India. Only British company to be engaged in trade with India between 1608 to 1813 was English East India Company. But the point is, in 1813, the Charter Act ended the trading monopoly of the East India Company in all the commodities except in two commodities, that is a tree and opium. So in these two commodities, East India Company still enjoyed a trading monopoly. It means that post 1813, all British companies were given permission by the British Parliament to carry out trade with India. They were given the permission to carry out trade with India in all the commodities except in tea and opium. In these two commodities, only East India Company had the trading monopoly. So, except East India Company, no other company was given the permission to carry out trade in these two commodities, that is, the tea and opium. The point is, tea back in those days was produced in China, and opium was forcibly cultivated in Bihar by the British. So the British forced the peasants of Bihar to cultivate opium. The East India Company procured opium from the peasants of Bihar and sold the same in Chinese market. And then the East India Company procured tea from the Chinese and sold the same in the European market. So these two commodities were still reserved for trade by the English East India Company. But other commodities of trade were thrown open to other British companies. This is the first major development that happened in the third phase, that is 1813 Charter Act. Second development is 1833 Charter Act. I told you the British Parliament kept passing legislations for every 20 years with a view to regulate the activities of East India Company. One such regulation was passed in 1833 called 1833 Charter Act. This act completely removed or it abolished the trading rights of the East India Company. So under the 1833 Charter Act, the trading rights of the English East India Company were completely removed, and the East India Company under the 1833 Charter Act was made to remain in India only as an administrative body. Only as an administrative body. So it was English East India Company after 1833 Charter Act was made to remain in India only as an administrative body and not as a commercial company. Not as a commercial, was not allowed to carry out any commercial activities. That is, it was prohibited from carrying trade and related activities. So what is the impact? The point is, after 1833, as a result of this 1833 Charter Act, all British companies were allowed by the British government to come to India and carry out trade as they like. They can come to India. So till 1813, only East India Company came to India for trade. The only British company to trade with India was the English East India Company. But after 1813, all British companies were allowed by the British Parliament to trade with India. At a point. This was the new development that happened. Take a look at the third development during this phase, dual tariff policy. So the British government during this phase followed a policy called dual tariff policy. So under this dual tariff policy, the export duties were kept very high, very high, whereas the import duties were kept almost nil or charged at a nominal rate. So during the third phase, the British followed a dual tariff policy. Dual tariff means the export duties were kept very high, whereas the import duties were almost removed, or even if they were charged at a very reasonable rate of very reasonable rate. So what is the outcome? So the point is, as a result of high export duties, so uh, uh, the high export duties were imposed with a view to discourage Indian exports to other parts of the world. So for example, what do you mean by exports? Say for example, if Indians, if they want to export their goods to other parts of the world, they were required to pay a very high export duty. So, for example, calicos. Calicos is a type of a textile. Muslin. Muslin is another type of a textile. So on calicos, 67% export duty was imposed. On muslin, 37% export duty was imposed. So for example, the cost of calicos is 100 rupees. If an Indian trader want to export calico textiles to say England, he was required to pay 67% export tax. So plus you add to it some transportation charges of say 30 rupees. So roughly the cost of the the calicos when it reached the British market was 200 rupees. Plus to add some profit of say 50 rupees, the final price of the calicos would be 250 rupees. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is the British export a very high export duties on the goods which were exported from India to other parts of the world. So the British came up with this policy to discourage Indian exports, to discourage Indian exports. I hope I'm clear. Then low import duties. So if the British companies, if they wanted to bring their goods to India, over such goods, the import duties was almost nil, or even if it was imposed at a nominal rate. And this policy was followed by the British with a view to encourage the British manufacturer. The point. So the point is this low import duties encouraged the British manufacturers to export their goods to India. Okay, point. So this low import duties greatly helped the British manufacturers, but these high import duties it discouraged Indian manufacturers of the goods. This is the development. So take a look at the outcome of this particular phase. But why did the British follow this free trade? What do you mean by free trade? Free trade means a trade without much of restrictions, either in the form of taxes or in the form of other kind of restrictions. But the point is, it was not a free trade in the true sense because it was a free trade, it was just a one-way free trade. If both the export duties and import duties were brought, uh, if they were made nil, if there were no export duties and if there were no import duties, we call it as a two-way free trade. But what the British followed essentially in India was not a two-way free trade, it was just a one-way free trade. One-way free trade. What do you mean by free trade? Free trade means trade without restrictions, quantity restrictions, quality restrictions, price restrictions, or restrictions in the form of taxes. If you are not restricting the entry or the import of the goods or export of the goods, we call it as a two-way free trade. But what the British essentially followed in India was not a two-way free trade, it was just a one-way free trade because the export duties were kept very high, but on the other hand, the import duties were almost nil at the point. But why did the British come up with this free trade? This is basically a one-way free trade. Why did the British come up with this free trade policy? They came with a free trade policy because of pressure from the British capitalists. Basically, by I told you from 1750s onwards, industrialization of England began. And by 1813, many uh, uh, capitalists had come up in England. Many business people had emerged in England. And these British capitalists were putting pressure on the British government to open up the Indian market for their goods, for their cheap machine manufactured goods. Basically, as a result of industrial revolution, many capitalists emerged in England, and these capitalists, they being wealthy individuals with political power, with political connections, they began putting pressure on the British government to allow them to trade with India without any restriction. Therefore, the British came up. Therefore, the British ended the trading monopoly of East India Company, 1813. So from 1813 onward, the British also came up with a dual tariff policy with a view to help the British manufacturers uh, easily sell their goods in the Indian market. That was what was the outcome? Outcome is the deindustrialization. First thing happened. So these the point is the point is the Indian artisans found it difficult to compete with the cheap machine manufactured goods of England, as a result of which the demand for the artisanal goods began to fall, and as a result, those industries began to get shut down in India. So let me repeat this point once again. So the point is, as a result of the British economic policies, uh, uh, the cheap machine manufactured goods of England began to flood the Indian market. The cheap machine manufactured goods of England began to flood the Indian market. So the Indian artisans were not able to sell their goods uh, because the machine manufactured goods of England were far cheaper when compared to the goods produced by the Indian artisans, and then as a result, uh, the Indian artisans were not in a position to sell their goods at all. As a result, deindustrialization began to take place. So this deindustrialization of India was directly a result of British economic policies. When deindustrialization began to take place, the natural outcome is unemployment. The artisans working in the industries of India began to lose their employment. All of them began to leave the towns and migrate back to the rural areas and began taking up agriculture as their profession. So the point is, the people who were working in the industries, the cottage industries, began to lose employment. All of them began to migrate back to the rural areas and began to take up agriculture as their profession. So unemployment began to increase in India as a result of the British economic policies during the third phase. That was the important outcome. So the outcome is deindustrialization of India happened. The point in India was an economic powerhouse during the ancient times. It was an economic powerhouse even during the medieval times. Till 1750s, India was an economic powerhouse. But from 1750s onwards, gradually, uh, the, the deindustrialization of India began to take place, and particularly it increased after 1813. The deindustrialization of India increased after 1813 AD. It was directly a result of the British economic policies. Come to the fourth phase. So take a look at some very notable observations made by few individuals. One is Bipan Chandra. So he is a very famous historian of modern Indian history, uh, great historian. He made this particular observation. So Indian handicrafts were exposed to fierce and unequal competition from machine-made goods from Britain. They faced extinction. This is basically a true observation. This is what actually happened during these British times. Take a look at the observation made by Karl Marx. A point. Though he did not visit India, he knew the situation unfolding in India, and he made this particular remarks in the context of the British economic policies. Take a look at this particular observation. British broke the Indian handlooms, destroyed the spinning loom, and inundated with cottons in the very mother country of cotton. The very mother country of cotton. Inundated with cottons, that is, uh, the cheap machine manufactured cotton textiles of England began to flood the Indian market, and as a result of which, India, which is known for producing high quality cotton textiles, began to get shut down as a result of the competition from the cheap machine manufactured cotton textiles of England. This is what we mean by very mother country of cotton, because the entire world cotton is believed to have been cultivated for the first time in India. India during the ancient times was known for producing high quality textiles. So these machine manufactured cotton textiles began to flood the Indian market, began to destroy the Indian handicraft industry, particularly the textile. It was in that context Karl Marx made this particular observation. Come to the last and the final phase. It is between 1860 to 1947. 1860 to 1947. We call this phase as finance capitalism. This phase is called as finance capitalism. So by this time, the British capitalists were sitting on large sums of money. So by 1860, the British capitalists had accumulated large sums of money, and these British capitalists started giving their money as a loan to the English East India Company, of course, backed by the British government. In fact, after 1860, there was no English East India Company, there was only a British Crown which was ruling India. So the point is, by 1860, the British capitalists had amassed large sums of money. So these British capitalists were giving their money as a loan to the British. They were giving their money as a loan to the British. So after 1858, the British Crown took over the responsibility of administration of India. They started giving money to the British government. They started giving money. They were giving the British capitalists were giving their money as a loan to the British government. Point. The British government used this loan money mostly to build railways. It also used the same loan money for defense purposes. So the point is, the British government post 1860 time period took large sums of money as loan from the British capitalists, used this loan money mostly for two purposes. One is the construction of railways, and second for defense. So the point is, uh, the British constructed railways not to benefit Indians, but to uh, but to uh, efficiently exploit the resources of India. The British built railways to further efficiently exploit the resources of India, not to benefit Indians. Okay, point. So the point is, the British constructed railways with a view to efficiently transport the minerals from the mines to the port cities. The British constructed the railways also with the purpose of uh, also to enable the manufactured goods of England uh, available even in the interiors of the country. Let me repeat this point once again. So, what was the purpose of building railways by the British? The British did not build railways to benefit Indians. They built railways to further their economic interest. How? One wanted to efficiently transport minerals from the mines to the ports, to the seaports, and from there they wanted to export those minerals to England, say for example iron ore and other minerals, and this can happen only through railways. So basically, railway lines were constructed connecting the centers of mine with the port cities. Railways were also constructed with the other objective, that is to uh, make the British manufactured goods available even in the interiors of the country. That was the intended objective of construction of the railways. That's the point. Second, defense. The British Crown took large sums of money as loan from the uh, British capitalists to fight wars in India. It also used the same money to fight wars with the neighboring countries of India. So for example, The British Crown used the money to fight wars with Afghanistan, Burma, etc. At the point. So, but the point is, the loan was taken by the British Crown, but the loan had to be repaid from the Indian taxpayers' money. Loan was taken by the British Crown, but who had to repay the money? It had to be repaid from the Indian taxpayers' money. Taking loan is not bad, but the purpose, if, if the loan amount is put to some efficient use, it will bring in results. But the point is, the British use the loan amount for unproductive purposes. Example, defense purpose. It fought numerous wars with the other countries of the world. So, for example, Bhutan, I'm sorry, it fought wars with Myanmar, it fought wars with Afghanistan. But who had to pay? Who had to pay? Who had to bear this? Point is, this entire loan amount had to be repaid from the Indian taxpayers' money. At the point. So it was an additional burden on the Indian. So what impact did this phase create on Indian economy? So basically, the impact that it created on this Indian economy was it resulted in penetration of village economy. Let me repeat this point. What was the outcome on the fourth phase on the Indian economy? Basically, till phase third, till third phase, the British manufactured goods were available only in the towns of India, but as a result of a rapid development of railways during the fourth phase, the British manufactured goods began to be available even in the rural areas of India. So, till the end of the third phase, the rural areas of India were still self sufficient. They were still self sufficient. But with the development and rapid expansion of the railways, the village self sufficiency was badly broken. This was because the manufactured goods of England also began to be available in the rural areas of India, and as a result, the rural industry began to get shut down, unable to face competition from the cheap machine manufactured goods of England. So, what happened in third phase? In third phase, only the urban industry collapsed, but in fourth phase, the cheap machine manufactured goods of England began to be available even in the rural areas. This was due to the expansion of the railways. So, in the fourth phase, unable to face competition from the cheap machine manufactured goods of England, even the rural sector in the rural industry began to get shut down. So, the deindustrialization of India was complete by the fourth phase. The third phase, only the urban industry collapsed. The fourth phase, all industries, even those industries existing in the rural areas of India, began to get shut down. This is what happened. So, in this context, an American writer by name Buchanan made a very interesting observation. Take a look at it. The armor of the isolated self-sufficient village, the armor of isolated self-sufficient village was pierced by the steel rail. Its life blood ebbed away. Its life blood ebbed away. That's all about the British economic policies. So, what impact did the British economic policies create on India? It resulted in a drain of wealth, it resulted in deindustrialization, it resulted in commercialization of agriculture, it also resulted in famine. Some other class we can go through uh, in detail the impact on the British economic policies, but for the time being, that's all for today. But in case if you have any doubts, you may raise a question. Thank you. Uh, but in case if you have any doubts, you may raise questions. Thank you.